complicated world of revivals, reboots, remakes, and reimaginings. With announcements of reboots, remakes, or revivals coming out constantly, I've realized that there's a surprising amount of people who don't actually know the difference between these terms. These continuations or retellings of a story can fall under a wide umbrella of categories from spinoff to sequel to remake, and while people often use the terms interchangeably, there's actually some pretty big differences that are often forgotten about. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the wide range of terms used to describe continuations, adaptations, or retellings on the big and small screen, as well as what you can typically expect from them as a viewer. It's the video you never asked for, but you're going to appreciate in the long run. Trust me. Let's get into it. Adaptation. Probably the word you see thrown around most often, an adaptation is a catch-all term that refers to just about anything that is being reworked into film. A poem, a play, a novel, a TV show, you name it. As long as it's inspired by prior work, it's an adaptation. Film adaptations are most often inspired by popular literary works, like Little Women or Emma, but the story can be altered depending on the director's personal interpretation and perspective. These changes can range from the exclusion of characters deemed unnecessary, the alteration of the narrative structure for clarity, or even tampering with the time period to appeal to audiences. William Shakespeare's work has been adapted to film on hundreds of occasions, with some choosing to be incredibly faithful to the source material, while others take creative license as they see fit. You might recall the legendary era of teen films that were inspired by his plays. Oh, how I miss them. Another example of varied adaptations is the 1782 novel Dangerous Liaisons, which has been faithfully retold in film several times, as well as reimagined in both 90s New York and 1930s China. Because adapting something allows for a wide berth of creativity, public reaction towards the news can vary. Some people prefer direct recreations of the story that they're familiar with, while others prefer to see more creative interpretations. The latter is typically the case if something has been adapted multiple times before. Either way, news that something is being adapted is not automatically a bad thing. It's whether or not they succeed in bringing anything new to the table that's important, which basically sums up the entire problem with Disney's animation to live-action model. Remake. Unlike adaptations, a remake allows for slightly less wiggle room as it specifically refers to a film that is following in the footsteps of another. Remakes, or recreations, typically feature the same basic storyline and characterization as the original film, with a few small changes that might be as simple as using better equipment to provide an enhanced viewing experience, or altering aspects of the story to be more topical. Unlike adaptations, which may vary from the source material as much as they want, in order to be considered a true remake, a film must be as similar to the original in terms of plot, character, and format as possible. The point is to update it, not change it. Because remakes allow for less creative liberty than adaptations, remakes can sometimes be faithful to a fault, as seen with 1998's shot-for-shot Psycho remake. Many people hear the word remake and think, if you've seen one, you've seen them all. But the film A Star is Born is a great example of the technique actually serving a purpose. First released in 1937, A Star is Born was followed by 3 separate remakes, one in 1954, another in 1976, and another most recently in 2018. All of the iterations of the film follow the same basic premise, but the ways they differ is a fascinating reflection of and insight into their respective time periods and industries. I'd highly recommend checking out Be Kind Rewind's video analyzing the films, it's fantastic. Although we seem to be getting the most remakes now, it was actually the 2000s that had the most, so far at least, with a whopping 189 remakes being released over the course of the decade. While many remakes come off as cash grabs, they're actually most often used as a way to share familiar stories to a wider range of people and cultures. Popular shows like Gossip Girl and The Office have been remade in various countries in the hopes of making them more accessible, while Hollywood's habit of remaking Asian horror films has actually served as many people's introduction to the genre. If you're still confused as to what the difference between your run-of-the-mill adaptation and a remake is, we'll use Charles Dickens' 1843 novel A Christmas Carol as an example. The story, which is set in the Victorian era, follows a grumpy old man named Ebenezer Scrooge who is visited by the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, and learns an important lesson about his behavior. One of the earliest full-length film adaptations of the book was 1935's Scrooge, and while Scrooge and its remakes follow the source material closely, A Christmas Carol has also served as inspiration for more innovative adaptations like 1988's Scrooged, 1992's The Muppet Christmas Carol, and 2009's Ghost of Girlfriend's Past. Reboot. Often used interchangeably with remakes, reboots are actually very different. A reboot may or may not share the same premise as the original work, but crucially, it establishes its own continuity, creating a fresh start in the world that typically revolves around a new set of characters. First popularized by the comic book industry, reboots typically rehash the core elements of the story that made it popular to begin with, while simultaneously adjusting it to better fit the new direction and audience. Reboots can keep as much from the previous film as they like, but also have the ability to start completely from scratch and disregard all previous backstories and plotlines. Unlike remakes, they don't focus on retelling the exact same storyline, but instead are free to go in another direction, effectively declaring any past plot points null and void. For instance, all of the Spider-Man live-action films introduce Peter Parker in the same manner. He's an awkward teen, he lives with his Aunt May, he gets bitten by a spider, yada yada yada. What changes every time Spider-Man is rebooted is not his origin story or characterization, but instead other aspects of the plot like the primary antagonist or his love interest. Although reboots of franchises are quite commonplace nowadays, especially when it comes to superhero IP, there was a time not so long ago when that wasn't the case. Back when Christopher Nolan took control of the Batman franchise, he decided to reset the chronology of the story that had been set in place with Tim Burton's Batman back in 1989. The Burton Batman series had 4 installments, ending with the poorly received Batman and Robin in 1997. Although 3 different actors played Bruce Wayne in this franchise, they were still the same person existing in the same universe, proved by Michael Gough's Alfred remaining a constant figure in the series. Christopher Nolan essentially hit the reset button with Batman Begins in 2005, and created his own universe that directly contradicted its predecessor, with his version of Batman having different origins and motivations. The success of his Dark Knight series prompted Hollywood to reboot more of their long-thought deceased franchises, wiping the slate clean and starting anew. Because reboots rely on the audience's familiarity with the original work, many are initially placed into production to reinvigorate interest in a franchise by attracting both new and old fans in a fail-safe scheme to ensure an increase in revenue. Although admittedly, it doesn't always work. Looking at you, the Mummy. One of the most famous rebooted franchises is James Bond. Although 7 different actors depicted the character over the course of 40 years, it wasn't until Daniel Craig took on the role in 2006 for Casino Royale that it was truly and officially rebooted, with this version of the super spy directly contradicting characterization and continuity that had been set up in earlier films. Reimagining. Remember how we were talking about creative adaptations earlier? Well, that's where reimaginings come into play. Although somewhat similar to a remake or reboot in that it is a retelling of something that has already been created before, a reimagining includes a large alteration that vastly changes the story, but includes tongue-in-cheek references to the original, either through characters or concepts. Think of 2014's Maleficent, for instance. Aside from the film adapting Disney's Sleeping Beauty from animation to live action, it also shifts focus to the villain instead of Aurora, resulting in a vastly different ending. Reimaginings are essentially adaptations that have taken enough creative liberties with the source material that one has to ask if it can even be considered an adaptation. Hence why you might see the ever-popular phrase, loosely inspired by, in the film's description. Reimagining was first widely used in the early 2000s, when 20th Century Fox marketed Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes as a reimagining of the films first made in the 1960s and 1970s. It was essentially a cop-out, a way of not committing to the terms reboot or remake for fear of upsetting fans of the source material, something 20th Century Fox was already dealing with due to the negatively received Star Wars prequels. Compared to the other film terms we've discussed, reimaginings can be a little difficult to spot because at their core, they're just creative adaptations. But popular examples I can think of include Clueless, 10 Things I Hate About You, Bewitched, and She's All That. I'm still waiting for my modern-day Wizard of Oz reimagining where a very drunk Dorothy is just trying to get home from the club. Retcon. This device can be utilized in nearly everything we've discussed thus far. Most often used when a movie universe needs to change up things in its past to resolve something in the future, retconning is to retroactively change something in a new series or movie in order to fix something in the prior work, like a confusing storyline or negative fan reception. Sometimes it can help resolve the issue, other times it creates more confusion and even plot holes. Retcons are especially prevalent in the Marvel and Star Wars universes, as the franchises started off significantly simpler and now require adjustments whenever new characters and stories are introduced. While retconning can sometimes pertain to a single throwaway line, there are occasionally films that are entire retcons themselves. In large franchises such as Terminator or Superman, there are ignored sequels, which refer to films that are no longer considered part of the canonical timeline of the new retconned story. By ignoring these films, they are able to go back to a series' roots and restart the narrative the way they want to, without having to reboot the entire franchise. For instance, 2018's Halloween is a direct sequel to the first film from 1978. It changes the ending of the first film and ignores what may have taken place in the 7 other sequels that preceded it. Revival. Almost exclusively used in TV land, revivals are most often confused with reboots. Unlike spin-offs, in which a television network creates an entirely new series around an existing character, a revival reintroduces most or many of the original program's storylines and characters, usually attempting to resolve story arcs that the original may have failed to complete, or simply updating a familiar format to address contemporary concerns. In contrast, reboots or remakes may feature some of the original characters, but they're usually played by new cast members without taking into account events or continuity that occurred during the original series. The upcoming And Just Like That is a revival of Sex and the City, for example, while 2018's Charmed was a reboot. Notably, the 2021 Gossip Girl series is a revival and continuation of the original 2017 drama series, which itself was adapted from Cecily von Zagazer's novel of the same name. While it features a new cast, it's set in the same world as the original Gossip Girl series, and even name drops past characters in a way of solidifying that point. Revivals are especially common in regard to family sitcoms, where characters who've since grown up are reintroduced in a new show that is restructured for the times, as seen with Fuller House and Punky Brewster. While the premise tends to be fairly straightforward and simple, many revivals struggle to succeed because they're unable to decide what audience they're making the show for. Is it the people who grew up watching it who are now older, or are you trying to find your original demographic but in a new era? This can result in an awkward viewing experience that is loaded with references to the original show to appease viewers, but without any new commentary that justifies its existence. 2021's iCarly revival, which, side note, I highly recommend watching, follows the character and her friends a decade after the events of the original series. The format and style of the show remains true to the 2007 series, but has updated sensibilities and more adult humor to appeal to their original audience that would now be in their 20s and 30s themselves.
Spencer, you know how cutthroat it is out here? All these new platforms and influencers getting younger and younger. It's like Harper always says, you gotta switch it up on a bitch.
It's still very over the top and Nickelodeon, but they're not afraid to discuss failed marriages, the evolution of the internet, and fears about adulthood. The success of the iCarly revival has also made me more upset about the cancellation of the planned Lizzie McGuire revival. Disney just needs to let Lizzie have sex. Spinoff. Similar to the revival, spin-offs, also known as retoolings or sidequels, often share continuity and characters with the original media in one way or another. The biggest difference, however, is that the new series or film centers around a specific character doing something else in the original world. The characters themselves tend to be a fan favorite, or one that could theoretically have their own story outside of the primary series. Take for instance Kim from the 90s sitcom Moesha, who left in the 4th season to star in The Parkers, which revolved around a mother-daughter relationship in a college setting, a vastly different premise than the original sitcom. Confusingly, spin-offs can also be seen as prequels or sequels, considering they tend to exist in the same universe with the same characters. I would consider 2018's Solo both a prequel and a spin-off. While spin-offs rarely tend to make the same impact as the original series, there are some exceptions. For instance, iconic 90s sitcom Saved by the Bell was itself a spin-off of the short-lived series Good Morning Miss Bliss. Frasier was a spin-off of Cheers, Family Matters was a spin-off of Perfect Strangers, and the list goes on. Some spin-offs prove so popular that they eventually go on to become full-fledged franchises with several ongoing series, like CSI or Law & Order. Although spin-offs are commonly utilized in the TV industry, there have been cases of spin-off films being created due to a character's popularity. Take 2005's Elektra, which took the character that was introduced in 2003's Daredevil and gave her her own film. This was pre-MCU, mind you, so this wasn't common yet. Other similar examples include Sharpay's Fabulous Adventure, a spin-off of the High School Musical franchise, Hobbs & Shaw, a spin-off of Fast and Furious, and Birds of Prey, a spin-off of Suicide Squad. Crossover. When a TV show or movie shares a creator or production company, they're able to utilize crossovers, a fun way of merging two or more popular IPs for the benefit of the audience. Crossovers are interesting in that they're typically not the premise of an entire show or movie, but more often than not a simple one-off episode that feels like a fever dream. You might recall Disney's more ambitious days when they featured not one, but 3 separate shows colliding for an all-out event. That's So Sweet Life of Hannah Montana and Wizards on Deck with Hannah Montana remain some of the most legendary viewing experiences of my young life. While these were typically a one-and-done situation, an entire series utilizing the crossover format would occasionally appear, like Sam and Cat, which took popular side characters from Nickelodeon's iCarly and Victorious series and stuck them together. A staple in Japanese cinema, the kaiju or strange beast genre would often have crossover films in which various monsters would team up and battle after being introduced in their own standalone films. Avengers who? The Quels. Perhaps the easiest to recognize, a pre-, mid-, or sequel is set in the same universe as the prior work, but set chronologically at a different time than the original film. While sometimes the premise for a show, such as The Carrie Diaries, Young Sheldon, or House of the Dragon, quels are most popular in the world of film as a way of profiting off of a brand the audience is already familiar with, or simply telling a more compelling story. Out of the 3 types, sequels are typically the most respected, as they tend to be conceived around the same time as the original work, creating a seamless continuation of the story, and therefore they don't negatively affect the audience's perception of the original. Nowadays, most sequels are planned in advance in the hopes of spawning another money-making franchise, but in earlier decades they would be tacked on as an afterthought, which resulted in many crappy sequels that turned off entire generations to the idea. Pre- and mid-quels are more recent developments in the film industry and are often regarded as cash grabs, as they're usually created years after the fact and can directly contradict the narrative of the original films, as seen with The Hobbit, Fantastic Beasts, and Star Wars. They're less about finding new audiences and more about giving the original audience new content. This isn't inherently a bad thing, but care must be taken into creating a story that is new while still maintaining the ideas put forth by the original series. Now that you know more about the types of adaptations, retellings, and continuations you might find in the film industry, you'll never have to mix up a remake and a reboot again. Although, let's be honest, it'll probably still happen on occasion. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!